Hey guys, tonight we travel to a place where law isn't written but spoken out loud from memory in the middle of a rocky field, surrounded by glacial rivers, volcanic cliffs, and judgmental sheep. You're not holding a scroll. There's no paper to crinkle, no gavel to slam. Just your voice and 1,000 expectant ears waiting to hear you recite an entire legal system by heart. This is medieval Iceland, and you've just been appointed the Lögsögumaður, the law speaker. That's right. You are now the walking, talking embodiment of national legislation. Your job is to memorize the entirety of the country's laws and deliver them piece by piece, year after year, at the Alþingi Iceland's open-air parliament. And yes, there's a terrifyingly good chance you'll forget something important right when the weather turns, say, avalanchy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little channel travels. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You squint into the rising mist at Thingvellir, a jagged natural amphitheater carved by continental drift and geological drama. It's not a cozy courtroom. It's a field, technically a rift valley, where the Eurasian and North American tectonic plates are quietly pulling apart under your sheepskin boots. There's a slight sulfur smell in the air, not unpleasant, just enough to remind you that the earth underfoot occasionally sneezes fire. It's dawn, and you're setting up camp alongside hundreds of other Icelanders arriving on foot and horseback from every fjord and far-flung farmstead. They bring their tents, their disputes, their fermented shark snacks, and their ears tuned for judgment. You head toward the Law Rock or Lugberg, a naturally elevated slab of basalt that acts as both pulpit and platform. It's your designated speaking place, your medieval TED Talk stage, and you'll be standing there quite a lot over the next few days, projecting your voice across the chill air, hoping the wind doesn't swallow your ruling on, say, whether a man can legally name his third child after a famous outlaw. You're nervous naturally. You're about to recite from memory a rotating third of the nation's law code, roughly enough words to fill a paperback. This performance happens every year, and it takes 3 years to cycle through the entire corpus. Miss a clause, mispronounce a term, and someone might challenge you. Politely? Probably. Historians still argue whether the law speaker was more of a ceremonial figure or an active judicial authority, but there's no doubt your role is critical. You are the glue binding oral tradition to communal justice. Iceland has no centralized king, no standing army, no elegant system of written bureaucracy. What it does have is you, your voice, and your memory. The crowd spreads out around the Law Rock like a low-simmering stew. There are booths and tents arranged in rings, turning this legal gathering into something of a summer festival, minus the funnel cake. Chieftains mingle, families chat, and somewhere in the distance, a child attempts to race a goat in a straight line. It doesn't go well. A hush falls. You climb the Law Rock and breathe deeply. The air is crisp and damp, tinged with the faint breath of snow lingering in the highlands. You begin your recitation not with pomp but with rhythm. Icelandic law is structured with poetic cadence, partly for ease of memory, partly because everyone here low-key loves a good saga. As you speak, something strange happens. The murmuring crowd leans in. It's not the content, they've heard it before, but the act. The ritual of someone holding centuries of communal knowledge in their mind and unspooling it with confidence. You recite laws about land inheritance, about the punishment for false accusations, about what to do when someone borrows your ox and brings back a smaller one. Hint, it's frowned upon. There's even a law about where to stand if you're peeing near someone else's field. Personal space mattered even in 930 AD. The quirky part: there's no official uniform. You wear whatever you own, usually wool, sometimes fur-lined, always damp. Unlike plague doctors with their beaky masks or Roman senators with togas, you, the law speaker, are just a guy with an enormous brain and a decent memory, possibly wearing socks your wife knit from the wool of a sheep. You're pretty sure once bit your cousin. As you continue, small knots of people whisper among themselves. Some jot mental notes preparing to bring their own disputes before a panel of chieftains. Others nap. That's fair. You've got the kind of voice that makes even judicial protocol sound like bedtime poetry, but you keep going steady and slow like water carving a riverbed. One by one, the clauses tumble from your tongue. You don't stop to explain them. That's not your job. Interpretation happens elsewhere, at the booths where disputes are heard among elders within households. Your task is transmission, accuracy, sounding cool while talking about sheep theft and grave-digging jurisdiction. By midday, the sun finally rises above the volcanic ridges. You're still speaking, and the people are still listening, more or less. Someone passes you a warm drink, probably mead or fermented whey, both of which you pretend to like. The wind picks up. Your cloak flaps heroically. You briefly feel like a Norse superhero whose only power is remembering footnotes. And maybe that's exactly what you are. Because here, in a society with no royal scribes or imperial libraries, memory is everything. The laws don't live in books. They live in you. You wake early the next morning to a sky the color of iron and the sound of someone trying unsuccessfully to boil water over a smoky campfire. There's a chill in the air that seeps into your bones, but you rise anyway because you've got laws to speak, and no one else in Iceland has bothered to memorize all of them. The crowd gathers again, wrapped in cloaks, rubbing hands together, muttering about sheep and inheritance. Some are here for the spectacle, others have pending lawsuits, a few are just cold and bored and hoping someone shares dried fish. But all eyes turn to the same place as you take your position on the law rock. You begin where you left off yesterday. The listeners tilt their heads slightly, half curious, half sleepy, as you launch into the intricacies of land boundaries, marriage rights, and the ever-popular rules for accidental axe injuries. Seriously, Iceland had a lot of rules about axes. Your voice is steady, but inside your head, you're navigating a mental labyrinth. There are no scrolls in your hand, no prompters, just a vast network of auditory memory associations and rhythm. You lean into the rhythm, especially hard now it carries you like a river carrying a boat. The law speaker Lögsogumadur isn't just some village trivia champion. It's a formal office elected for a term of 3 years and chosen from among the most respected chieftains or legal minds. There's debate among scholars about how much authority you really have. Were you merely a mouthpiece or more of a judge? Historians still argue whether the law speaker actively shaped interpretations of the law or simply recited them verbatim. Either way, when you speak, people listen. or at least pretend to. There's a surprising amount of drama in the air. You wouldn't think standing and reciting a legal code would be exciting, but the stakes are high. People have journeyed across the entire island to hear this. Some are hanging on your words to know how their land will be divided or whether their cousin's goat fence violated Statute 103B. That last one might not actually exist, but if it did, you'd be the one to know. And yet, for all its seriousness, your role is wrapped in ritual and tradition. You don't just speak, there's performance to it. You pause at precise beats. You use inflection to distinguish sections. You sometimes repeat key lines so the crowd can internalize them. Icelanders call this the law song, even though it's more of a chant or a drone than a melody. But the sing-song rhythm helps everyone remember and helps you avoid disaster. You've trained for this your whole life. Before being elected law speaker, you served as a Goti part chieftain, part priest, part problem solver. You sat through countless assemblies. You memorized old rulings. You built up your legal mind like a muscle, gradually, repetitively, stubbornly. There's no court stenographer, no leather-bound copy to consult. Your backup is, well, you don't have one. If you drop a law, it might vanish. Sure, there are others in the crowd who've memorized bits and pieces, former law speakers, overly enthusiastic farmers, but the complete structure rests with you. To keep it all straight, you divide the content mentally into categories: land law, marriage law, theft and violence, disputes over naming rights. Yes, there were laws for that too. You picture each one as a section of a house: the door to your right inheritance law, the dark hallway behind you, homicide and manslaughter, that cozy nook with the slightly suspicious draft, domestic disputes, and boundary markers. You've built an entire memory palace inside your skull, populated not with statues or flowers, but with clauses and subclauses, oral precedents, and punishment scales. The walls are made of frost-covered wood beams. The floor creaks when you tread near repeat offenses. And don't get cocky, this palace has traps. If you walk the wrong corridor, you might jump ahead by 2 years' worth of laws. So you step carefully. The people listening probably assume this is easy for you, that you just know it. But you've rehearsed in your head for days before this, while tending sheep, while sitting around fire pits, while chewing on the world's toughest dried fish. And every time you remember a complicated passage correctly, it's a tiny private victory, like finding your glove in the dark. You get through the first half of today's recitation with minimal stumbles, just one moment where you nearly misquoted a clause about trade penalties for smuggling timber, which, to be fair, no one in the back cared about. You cover your pause with a cough, smooth, classic law speaker maneuver. As the sun reaches its apex, by which we mean it rises 10 degrees above the horizon and promptly stalls, you pause for a break. A few folks clap politely. One man in a fur-lined hood offers you a chunk of smoked puffin. You eat it. It's awful. You nod in thanks. After lunch, it's back to the rock. More laws, more rhythmic cadence. You find yourself slipping into a trance almost. The words flow faster now, connected not just by logic, but by story. This law leads to that one because a similar situation happened in some village 15 winters ago. You remember that story. It's part of your mental archive. Every now and then, you make eye contact with someone in the crowd, someone who visibly reacts. A nod, a smirk, a raised brow. Those little ripples of recognition tell you they remember too. Oral tradition is alive, and your words are keeping it breathing. And as your voice echoes off the lava cliffs of Thingvellir, you begin to feel something ancient and heavy stirring in your chest. Not fear or ego, something simpler, like stewardship. You're not just remembering law, you're carrying a culture on your tongue. Tomorrow you'll rise and do it all again. For now you finish your final sentence with a tone of calm authority. The crowd begins to disperse for the evening off to prepare their grievances or boil more fish. You descend from the law rock quietly, your voice a little raw, but your mind still buzzing. Just 2 more days to go in the cycle. And you haven't forgotten a thing. You sleep fitfully that night under a damp wool blanket, your dreams filled with floating clauses and oddly argumentative sheep. Somewhere in your subconscious, a voice keeps repeating the rule about how many witnesses are required for a blood feud. You wake before dawn, heart thumping, convinced you've forgotten a paragraph. You haven't, but that anxiety is baked into the job. The third day of the Althingi dawns gray and wind-bitten. Mist rolls down from the hills like an indecisive army, cloaking the booths and tents in low, ghostly fog. A distant raven calls out harsh and accusatory, as if reminding you that yesterday you barely made it through the livestock taxation clauses without a hiccup. You stretch sip from a water skin that tastes faintly of leather and regret and prepare yourself. Today is the day of dispute laws, the rules that determine how one person can accuse another, what counts as evidence, and who gets to say, "You owe me a sheep, you rascal." You make your way back to the Law Rock. The crowd is a little thinner this morning. Many folks are now preoccupied with arguing cases in the booths or trying to sell pickled trout. But the faithful remain. They're bundled tightly in their cloaks, half listening, half daydreaming, and waiting for that one legal phrase that might save or ruin their uncle's property rights. You begin with the essentials: how a claim is brought, how long after the offense someone can seek justice, called the time limit clause, and how many people you need to witness an event for it to count legally. Spoiler, it's usually 6 men, unless it's something really scandalous, in which case 12 might be required. Iceland didn't mess around when it came to corroboration. There's something oddly satisfying about these structures. They're not perfect, but they're thorough. For example, if someone accuses you of stealing their horse, they must declare it publicly and then repeat the accusation at 3 different sites, including the alleged scene of the crime, loudly. With full names, it's like a very solemn, legally binding game of say it to my face. Historians still argue whether these procedures developed organically through local traditions or were inspired by older Norse customs from Norway and beyond. What's clear is that the system tried to blend public accountability with communal memory. After all, without written records, the only proof of an event was who remembered it and whether those memories matched. You take a breath and continue. You move into compensation law now, and things get spicy. Iceland's medieval society leaned heavily toward wergild, a structured payment system for wrongs done. If you broke someone's nose, you paid a set fee. If you accidentally killed their brother in a sheep herding accident, which weirdly happened a lot, you paid more. The idea was to limit the cycle of revenge. No eye for an eye. Instead, you broke it, you buy it, in human life form. It's not all grim. There are oddly specific fines, Like if you cut another man's beard without consent, it's a serious insult punishable by a full 3 marks of silver. Why? Because beards were a sign of masculinity and honor. Shaving someone was basically calling them a weakling in front of their ancestors. Honestly, still kind of true. You stumble briefly over a clause about where to stand during a trial. Yes, that was also regulated. Standing in the wrong place could invalidate the entire hearing. So now you've got people rehearsing legal geography like actors blocking a stage play. No, no, Björn, you have to face west when declaring your innocence west. But the real tension comes when you speak of outlawry, the ultimate punishment. If someone committed a serious enough offense and failed to make restitution, they could be declared full outlaw. That meant anyone could kill them on sight. No consequences. They were literally removed from the protection of the law. The crowd always reacts to this. Even the ones napping sit up when they hear the word outlaw, because everyone knows someone who was banished or who barely escaped it. Some outlaws lived in caves, eking out a survival. Others fled the island. A few became legends. Just don't ask how many of those legends are true. You pause for water. Your voice is holding, though it's picked up a rasp that makes you sound even more mysterious and authoritative. Unintentional win. A breeze ripples across Thingvellir. Somewhere a horse snorts impatiently. Two chieftains nod to each other over a campfire and begin arguing over boundary stones. You keep speaking. Now come the laws about insults. In modern Iceland, someone calling you a troll sniffer might be funny. Back then, grounds for serious legal recourse. There's an entire subcategory of honor violations where calling someone cowardly unmanly or accusing them of magic could lead to trials, fines, or worse. In fact, a well-placed insult could escalate into a full legal feud if it struck the wrong nerve. One law in particular, still hotly debated, lays out the punishment for a man who composes and spreads a defamatory poem. That's right, defamatory poetry was a legal offense. Imagine being sued for a diss track 950s style. It might seem petty, but honor was everything. You couldn't write it down. You couldn't tattoo it on your arm. It had to live in the way people remembered you. So the law stepped in, tried to keep things fair, or at least structured. And that's the real takeaway, isn't it? Medieval Iceland didn't have a king or a jail system. It had memory, collective, ritualized, highly vocal memory, which meant the law had to be something everyone understood, even if they didn't like it. You finish the section on verbal insults and start into the laws on slavery. Yes, there were slaves known as threll, usually captured from abroad or born into servitude. Iceland's laws on their treatment were surprisingly detailed, though still steeped in the hierarchies of the day. You feel a weight in your throat when you speak those lines. The crowd is silent. No one laughs. And just as the sun starts slipping low again, trapped in its Nordic arc, never quite overhead, you wrap up your third day of speaking. You step down to murmurs of approval. Someone hands you a dried herring. This counts as applause. Back at your tent, you lie down, cloak wrapped tightly, and replay every line in your head. You miss nothing. You whisper one clause aloud just to be sure. The one about how if a man kills another during a formal duel, but forgets to shout the proper victory phrase afterward, it might not count. Iceland, man, it's got rules. You wake to the soft clatter of hooves over basalt and the far-off bark of a dog chasing something it probably won't catch. Morning frost curls like lace over the edges of your boots, and for the briefest moment you wonder what it would be like to live in a place where mornings start with warmth instead of fog. Then again, if warmth were the goal, you wouldn't be living in a lava-strewn country with exactly one tree and a national dish that smells like angry vinegar and shark. Today is a rest day at the old thingy. Technically, that means fewer laws spoken aloud, more private trials underway in the booths, and a lot of people awkwardly pretending not to eavesdrop. For you, it's a chance to practice, refine, and most importantly, review your memorized collection of property laws. You sit cross-legged on a cold rock with your back to the wind, and you begin reciting quietly. These are some of the trickiest, driest, and oddly most controversial parts of the Gragas Law Code. Who owns what, where the boundary lines fall, and what happens if someone's sheep wanders over them like a wool-covered outlaw with no concept of trespassing? You'd think memorizing land laws would be dull. You'd be right, but it's also where the weirdest arguments happen, like the one about a man who claimed a lava field had shifted his property line, which according to the law was technically possible because Iceland's landscape does change underfoot. Historians still argue whether the land division systems used in the 10th and 11th centuries were consistent across regions, or if each quarter of Iceland applied the laws differently. But one thing's clear, people were deeply personally invested in what counted as theirs. And in a place where your field might get eaten by a volcano overnight, you tended to mark it obsessively. Take fences, for example, not optional. According to the law, if you had cattle, you had to build and maintain fencing around your land. If your fence failed and your cow wandered into someone's barley patch, the blame was yours. And if that cow then got into a fight with a goat and the goat died, that's a three-clause situation with witnesses required. And it doesn't stop at living things. The law has entire subcategories for water rights. Yes, you can memorize 300 lines of where one man's fishing stream ends and another's begins. If a stream split around an islet and one half of the stream dried up in winter, guess what? There's a rule for that. One of your favorites, because yes, you're at the stage where you have favorites, is the stacked turf wall clause. If a wall collapsed and your neighbor rebuilt it on your side of the property line, you could challenge it, but only if you filed the claim within 5 nights. After that, the wall legally belonged where it stood, and you just lost a strip of land because you hesitated. Welcome to Icelandic real estate anxiety. You're muttering through one particularly complex line about shared grazing commons when a boy from a nearby booth plods up with a sheepish look and a bundle of flatbread. Mother says you looked hungry, he mumbles. Also, she says you got the inheritance clause wrong yesterday, but not by much. You raise a brow. You didn't get it wrong, but you accept the bread and nod solemnly. This is how the memory testing begins, not by grand ceremonies, but by small corrections whispered from people who learned the same words from a different uncle. Everyone's a footnote here. You spend midday seated with a chieftain who's sponsoring a small revision of livestock passage rights. Basically, he wants to redefine a narrow trail so that his sheep can legally cross a neighbor's land without causing a lawsuit every spring. You both review the relevant clauses, reciting in tandem until the boundaries blur between memory and logic, between speech and land. And there's a strange beauty in this. No ink, no books, just human minds functioning as living archives. You carry not just law, but social order, seasonal cycles, and silent agreements made audible once a year beside this cold, rushing river. As the wind picks up again in the afternoon, you move to practice one of the most ancient and oddly poetic sections laws concerning heirless property. When someone died without named heirs, their land didn't vanish into limbo. It reverted to the community or was sometimes redistributed by chieftains. But if a long-lost cousin showed up 2 years later with a dramatic saga about being shipwrecked near Dublin, they could theoretically claim it back, so long as they knew the ancestral lineage and could recite the legal phrases confirming the connection. Think of it like a medieval version of, can you pass the security question for this estate? Again, historians still argue whether this heir-based redistribution worked in practice or was mostly an aspirational framework. The oral nature of the system meant everything hinged on people's ability to remember and their willingness to correct one another out loud. In other words, it worked until someone forgot or lied convincingly. You pause to rest your voice and watch two men arguing over a boulder that allegedly moved downhill and is now disrupting someone's potato patch. You hear the words boundary stone and sloped erosion and suppress a sigh. That clause is in Section 117 under land distortion due to gravity. You'll probably be asked to recite it by dusk. Evening rolls in slow and smoky. Someone is burning driftwood, always a treat in a land with so few trees, and the smell curls through the thing like a scented reminder that survival here has always hinged on creative use of resources. By now, the official speaking is done for the day, but a small group forms around you near the Law Rock. Some want to hear the old passages for fun. Others are hoping to catch you in a mistake. One old man with half a tooth and an impressive brow asks if you remember the legal phrasing for how to divide fish caught in shared nets. You do. You recite it word for word. He nods once satisfied, then offers you a dried lump of something you hope is kelp. Again, Icelandic applause. As night creeps in, you reflect on how much you've internalized not just law, but culture. These rules aren't detached or abstract. They're stories. People's feuds, fears, livestock-related disasters, all compressed into clauses and memorized by heart. And as the stars flicker like distant runestones above the black horizon, you whisper one last passage aloud before sleep, the rule about dividing whale meat found washed ashore. Equal shares unless someone saw it breach. Then the spotter gets more. Because fairness in Iceland applies even to the whales. You wake to a goat chewing on your bootstrap. Not aggressively, just a soft, rhythmic gnawing, like it's testing whether leather is food or merely aspirational. You wiggle your foot gently. The goat blinks unbothered and resumes chewing. You don't even try to stop it this time. You're already mentally reciting the clauses on animal ownership and compensation for damages caused by rogue livestock. Because today you finally step into the most labyrinthine part of Icelandic law, family inheritance and kinship claims. If yesterday's property laws were about rock streams and missing cows, today's are about blood grudges and who gets what when someone dies inconveniently. And let's be honest, death here tends to arrive on horseback. You walk back to the Law Rock with the wind pressing sideways, pushing your cloak against your knees. The crowd is thicker again. People love inheritance laws, not because they understand them, but because they think they might benefit from them. You open with the foundational rule sons inherit first. If no sons, then daughters. If no daughters, then brothers. If no brothers, then cousins. And if you run out of those, well, welcome to the avalanche of legal improvisation. The Gargas Code devotes long, deeply tangled passages to exactly how inheritance works in cases of remarriage, adoption, illegitimacy, or blood feuds. Historians still argue whether this was an attempt to create social order or just a desperate effort to keep drunk cousins from stabbing each other over sheep and silver rings. Take, for instance, the clause on half-siblings. If you share a mother but not a father, you inherit a smaller portion than if you shared a father but not a mother. Why? Because patrilineal lines mattered more for property, but maternal lines were more reliable for identifying who actually belonged to whom. Paternity tests. Not exactly a thing. You recite these with care, layering the clauses like bricks in a wall. Everyone's listening now. Not just the hopeful inheritors, but the careful record keepers, the ones who remember family lines like priests remember scripture. At one point, you pause to repeat a phrase. Should the deceased be found to have fathered a child abroad, and that child return with proof of kinship, such inheritance shall be weighed at half value unless the child is born of a union deemed equal. There are about 6 qualifiers in that single sentence. That's the kind of logic this law code specializes in: recursive, conditional, and packed with clauses like an overstuffed stew. And there's still more, like the rules about dividing inheritance by type. Weapons go to male heirs unless specifically bequeathed. Spindles and weaving tools, traditionally passed to women. Livestock gets divided last, which is ironic since livestock is how most people survive. You suspect that's intentional, meant to prevent people from killing off their wealthy relatives just to snag the family pig herd. Then come the hot debates like when a man dies without naming a wife, but with a longtime companion. Can she inherit depends on the witnesses, the length of cohabitation, and whether her dowry was ever formally acknowledged. It's like watching medieval Iceland invent common law marriage through sheer legal stubbornness. Quirky fact: there's a documented clause for what happens if someone dies and 2 heirs claim the same wooden chest, but it turns out the chest contains nothing but ice skates and a dead gull. Technically, the chest must still be divided fairly. The skates are property. The gull may be symbolic, maybe lunch. Evening approaches, but you're still reciting. The crowd has grown quiet, some from fascination, others from confusion. The family trees in their minds are already sprawling into forests. One woman turns to her husband and whispers, "So if your uncle's second wife's son dies and leaves a ring, does that mean?" She never finishes. No one ever does. You finish the main inheritance clauses with a surprising bit of poetry. Yes, some passages are written almost like verse, probably to help memorization. You soften your voice and let the rhythm carry you. By stone and strand, by branch and braid, let kin be known where oaths are made. The blade to son, the ring to bride, and silver shared where law decides. Even the goats seem to pause at that. You take a sip of sour milk from a horn and let your thoughts drift. These laws don't just regulate things, they bind people. They're a net woven through memory, tying one life to the next. And you, with your thousands of lines of memorized clauses, are the keeper of those threads. The stars start to return. Thingvellir turns quiet except for the low murmur of families reviewing their own inheritance claims out loud. You walk slowly back to your booth, brain, buzzing, mouth dry, heart steady. A young man steps into your path and bows slightly. "Excuse me," he says, "what's the rule if I inherit land, but my cousin still lives on it and won't leave?" You pause. Recite the answer from memory. It's in the dispute clause of property transfer after succession. Yes, he must give notice. Yes, the cousin has 3 full moons to vacate. No, he cannot keep the cows. Yes, this includes dwellings but not buried treasure. The young man grins. "I knew you'd know." Then he hands you a pouch of dried bilberries. Icelandic applause, part 5. Later, as the wind hums like distant chanting and your eyes begin to droop, you lie back and whisper one last clause aloud. "Should inheritance be contested, let 3 men hear the claim and speak their witness in sunlight." Your voice fades into the night. The goats thankfully have moved on to chewing someone else's boots. You awaken before dawn not from noise or movement, but from the oddly suspicious silence of a crowd that's trying very hard not to disturb you while standing 5 feet away. A ring of farmers, traders, and chieftains have formed around your sleeping mat, all with that same look, equal parts polite interest and low-level panic. One man coughs gently, like someone asking a librarian for help finding the accidental axe murder section. You sit up, brush straw from your beard, or eyebrows, and they instantly begin talking over one another. Because this morning the topic is outlawry, and everyone wants to know if their neighbor might be one. You stand clear your throat and begin. "If a man be declared full outlaw, let him be without shelter, without food, and without the protection of law for no less than 3 winters. A few people in the crowd subtly step away from a red-haired guy with shifty eyes. He pretends not to notice. The laws of outlawry are where things get weirdly theatrical. See, early Iceland didn't have a police force, no sheriff, no jail. So when someone seriously messed up murder, arson, betrayal during a duel, you didn't lock them up. You declared them socially erased, like legally unpersoned. Can't buy bread, can't borrow a horse, can't even sit down in a public booth without someone throwing rotten shark meat at you. It's like being unfollowed by everybody permanently in real life. There were 2 flavors of outlawry, full and lesser. Full meant forever and usually ended with you freezing to death in the highlands. Lesser meant 3 years and you had the option of exile, assuming you could survive the boat ride and not annoy any Irish monks along the way. Historians still argue whether this was meant as mercy or just a very elegant death sentence wrapped in social awkwardness. But here's the wild part: you could sometimes buy your way back into society. If you had powerful relatives or made a fancy enough gift to the right chieftain, you might get reinstated. Nothing says oopsie like handing over a whole boatload of walrus tusks. And if you killed an outlaw, that was perfectly legal. In fact, if the outlaw came too close to the legal assembly during thing, you could literally walk up, declare your intent to kill them, and do it right there. Public service, basically. Like street sweeping, but messier. You walk slowly along the edge of the gathering, your cloak brushing over heather and dust, reciting the clauses with steady rhythm. If he be found within bowshot of the assembly after the sun has risen, let him be struck down without guilt. And should a man offer bread to the outlaw, let him too be fined no less than 12 ounces of silver. And then the odd one. If a woman grants shelter to an outlaw but lay no hand in his crime, Let her be shamed, but not fined. That's weirdly generous. Historians still debate whether this was an early loophole for romance or just an awkward admission that sometimes outlaws had very good hair. You shift your tone and offer a case study. Every law speaker needs a few dramatic examples. Gunnar of Hlíðarendi, you say, slowly was declared outlaw for killing men in self-defense, and yet refused to leave. He stood in his doorway with his bow drawn and said he loved his home too much to go. People nod. Everyone knows the saga. Gunnar tragically heroic. Gunnar speared on his own threshold because he couldn't bear to leave his fjord. And Njal, you continue, the wise one burned in his own house rather than violate the laws he lived by. You pause, let the silence settle. People always get reverent at this part. Reverent and quietly worried that they too might be outlaws someday and not know it yet. Quirky tidbit. There's one clause about what happens if an outlaw turns up disguised as a seal. It's probably metaphorical. Probably. You wave a hand beckoning the scribe over. The man's beard is covered in ink again. He looks like he's been licking ravens. You dictate slowly. Let it be known that outlawry shall not excuse debt nor relieve a man of obligation to repay stolen goods. Even if you're erased from society, you're still expected to pay people back. Icelandic justice, brutal and passive-aggressive. The crowd begins to murmur. A thin man near the front asks nervously, "What if an outlaw has children? Do they inherit the shame?" You nod solemnly. Yes, to some extent, but also no. The law allows for the redemption of kin, where children can prove themselves loyal to the community and gradually remove the stain of their parents' crimes. It's equal parts justice and Scandinavian redemption arc. By midday, the clouds are low and heavy. You stop for a moment, pull your cloak tighter, and glance out over the valley. Thingvelir's Rift Valley yawns wide and quiet, a reminder of slow tectonic motion and even slower legal decisions. You finish with the final clause. Nersinonymai surgindermanin chirium. If an outlaw be found and begs mercy with no blade drawn, let the assembly judge whether clemency be granted. But let no man forget mercy to his law. You roll the words like stones on your tongue, and the crowd exhales. A boy may be 10 steps forward and offers you a warm piece of flatbread. You accept, break it in half, and give him the other piece. A small moment of legal neutrality, neither outlaw nor citizen, just two people splitting a snack. As you sit down to eat, someone mutters behind you, "Maybe I'm an outlaw." And someone else replies, "We all are deep down." You don't argue. You just chew slowly and look at the sky. The wind rolls down the Rift Valley like a messenger too tired to shout, brushing your cloak and the brittle moss at your feet. There's a rhythm to this land, slow, solemn, a little damp, and you've started to match it without meaning to. By now you've memorized more than law. You've memorized the way the air tastes before a storm. After outlawry comes something subtler, inheritance. Because yes, this next clause cluster is a bit more domestic. Less stabbing, more awkward family dinners. Today you're explaining who gets what when someone dies. And just like everything else in early Iceland, it's both absurdly specific and held together with dramatic loopholes. You speak aloud. Let it be known that land and livestock pass first to sons, then to daughters, then to brothers of the deceased, unless said brothers are known to be cursed by fate or fire. Yep, cursed by fate is in there. Probably not enforceable in modern courts, but boy does it make for good listening. A woman at the edge of the gathering raises her hand. She's holding a goat. Not a metaphor. What if I raise the livestock myself, she asks, squinting up at you with sun-baked suspicion. Do I still lose it to my brother when my husband dies? And you sigh, this is going to be that kind of day. The goat bleats unhelpfully. You explain while Icelandic inheritance law technically favors patrilineal descent, father to son, then to male relatives, it also includes clauses for women of proven stewardship. That means basically if you've been running the farm, the law might let you keep it. Historians still argue whether this clause was regularly enforced or just a polite way of saying, we'll think about it. Some sagas suggest women fought court cases and won. Others imply they just poisoned someone and moved on. You continue. If a man dies without kin and his estate lies unclaimed for 12 moons, let the land be reclaimed by the district and the house broken down to stones. That's right, no heirs. Your house gets disassembled. It's like a tax, but with hammers. And of course, there's the issue of marriage gifts because dowries, betrothal coins, and wedding cloaks of honor all come into play. You have to sort out what was given to whom by whom for what purpose and whether they were drunk when they gave it. Let it be known, you intone that cloaks given on the day of union remain the property of the bride, unless the union was not consummated by the third sunrise, in which case the cloak shall return to the groom's mother. Yes, that's a real clause, possibly invented just to confuse future law speakers. And don't even get started on heirlooms of blood. That's the legal term for weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial pants passed down through generations. You pause, take a sip of warm, weigh not good, not bad, just therein recite the famous clause. If the sword has passed through 3 sons, it must never be sold. Should it be sold, the buyer must offer his own blood within 7 days to sanctify the trade. You look up. A merchant near the fire turns a little pale and quietly tucks something shiny deeper into his cloak. The audience chuckles, well, some of them. Others are frantically recalculating their family trees and wondering if they're about to lose a field. The quirky tidbit for today Icelanders once argued in court over the inheritance of a trained falcon. The bird had been taught to carry messages and retrieve small objects. The problem, it kept flying back to the dead guy's house. Ownership, the plaintiff argued. Loyalty, the defense replied. Nobody knows who won. Probably the falcon. You're halfway through the livestock subsection when a boy interrupts holding a sheep on a rope. She's pregnant, he says solemnly. Who do the lambs belong to? You blink. It's a good question. And buried somewhere between clause 372 and 373 is the answer. If a ewe be heavy with young at the time of ownership transfer, the lambs shall belong to the new keeper, unless the animal was loaned, not sold, in which case the lambs are to be split half to each party, or an odd number, the greater to the owner. Yep, lambs are legally divisible, in theory. The boy nods like this makes perfect sense and walks away. The sheep looks significantly less sure. You stretch your back, feeling every vertebra pop like an old manuscript scroll. Even this late in the day, people are still asking about landmarks, those awkward boundaries that separate one man's meadow from another's goat path. Let a cairn of no less than 7 stones be the marker you recite, and let no man disturb the cairn unless he seek a challenge in court, which is a poetic way of saying don't move the fence unless you want a lawsuit and possibly a duel. Scholars still argue whether people respected this or if everyone just casually rearranged rocks in the dead of night. You suspect both. Even the sky feels like it's listening now. The clouds press lower, the moss soaks up your words like scripture. You end with a reminder that inheritance isn't just about stuff, it's about identity. If your great-great-grandfather owned that hill, it's not just a hill, it's your hill. Your saga starts there. Your reputation lives there. And if you lose it, well, you still have your words, and in Iceland, that might be enough. The moss beneath your boots has turned springy like old parchment left too long in a damp cellar. Every step makes a sound halfway between a sigh and a squelch, which is honestly kind of appropriate given the topic you're about to dive into duels. Yes, it's time for the part of Icelandic law that's less polite arbitration over disputed pastures and more, whoever bleeds less wins. Because even in a society governed by memorized legislation, sometimes the only way to settle a disagreement is to hit each other with sticks legally. You take your place on the law rock and begin voice steady. Let it be known that trial by combat shall be permitted when no other witnesses can be found, and the matter is of honor, inheritance, or insult. Not every grudge gets a duel, mind you. There are rules. You can't just throw down a glove because someone ate your cheese. Unless, of course, that cheese was part of a dowry, then oddly enough, yes. The most famous of these legalized brawls was the holmgang, a duel fought on a cloak or small island, often involving precisely calibrated spear shields, and the deeply impractical rule that you can only step outside the cloth 3 times before forfeiting. Historians still argue whether the 3-step rule was consistently enforced or if it was just an early Icelandic form of interpretive dance. But the law speaker must know it all, so you begin to recite the official format. 2 men may meet at dawn, each bearing weapons of agreed type and size. The duel may end in first blood surrender or death according to the terms announced beforehand. Sounds reasonable until you realize agreed terms usually translated to whoever could shout louder at sunrise. There's even a documented case where the combatants dug holes to stand in so that neither had height advantage. This might sound noble, but mostly it meant a lot of ineffective stabbing and one guy getting stuck waist-deep in clay. The audience today is particularly rapt, probably because there's nothing like sanctioned violence wrapped in legalism to wake people up. You continue warming to the rhythm. Should a man refuse a lawful challenge, his honor shall be diminished, and he may not testify in court until he completes a pilgrimage or makes public restitution. Yep, say no to a duel, and you're legally labeled a coward until you walk to a shrine and apologize to everyone. There's even a ritual for announcing the duel. You have to proclaim your intention at 3 public gatherings, naming your opponent each time. If you skip a step, the duel is invalid, and you just look like a guy waving an axe at no one. The quirky tidbit: there was a brief period where duels were allowed to be sung. Yes, if both parties agreed, you could resolve the matter through competitive insult poetry. The winner was judged by the loudness of applause and whether the loser cried. Iceland, where rap battles and blood feuds coexist peacefully. You glance down at your feet. The law rock has small grooves worn into it, indentations from centuries of boot heels pacing back and forth, reciting who stabbed whom where, and whether the blade had a family crest etched into it. Of course, not everyone who challenged the duel actually wanted to fight. Sometimes the point was just to force a settlement. If the guy you challenged was wealthy and risk-averse, he'd rather pay you off than risk a broken leg and public embarrassment. Legal extortion maybe, smart extortion definitely. And while the Althing allowed duels, It also allowed for what you now recite as the cooling period, a waiting time between challenge and combat, during which mediators could step in and say, hey, maybe just talk it out. Historians still argue whether this clause was effective at de-escalation or simply gave fighters more time to sharpen their axes. The answer probably is both. As you move through the text, there's a sudden hush in the crowd. They know what's coming. Shield laws. Not just literal shields, though, yes, those too, but legal protections for the elderly clergy and pregnant women. If any of those groups were wronged and someone tried to duel them, the attacker would face steep fines, possibly exile, and a social reputation downgrade equivalent to being called a wet sock. Let it be known you say clearly that one who draws blood from a shielded person shall repay in silver twice the value of the injury and once again for the insult. An old man near the front grins and nudges his friend. You have a feeling he's milked that clause more than once. It's nearly dusk now, as the shadows stretch long across the assembly field. You raise your hands, signaling the final clause for this section. If a man is slain in duel, and the duel was lawful, the killer shall not be punished, but he shall carry the body 3 paces and place it upon the earth arms, crossed as a sign of peace. It's a strange mix, violence and ritual aggression and honor. But for a society without a king, these rules were their monarchy. The blood, the bones, the rules about where you can stand and how loud you can shout before it becomes a felony. This was the glue that held Iceland together. And you, lucky you, are the glue's narrator. The sun, such as it is in this part of the world, hangs low like a flickering candle set in a smoky glass lantern. Around the Law Rock, the crowd settles into that peculiar Icelandic stillness, a quiet so deep it's almost suspicious, like the moment before someone yells fire in a crowded longhouse. You clear your throat, your voice rolling softly across the stone. Let us now speak of exile. Ah, yes. The medieval Icelandic version of You're Grounded, except it involves actual banishment to volcano-riddled nowhere, and if you're lucky, a boat. If you're not, it involves frostbite seals and more time than anyone ever wants to spend with their brother-in-law. In a world with no centralized government, no jails, and very few professional guards, exile was how you hit pause on a problematic citizen. Or, in the more poetic phrasing of the laws, he shall not walk among us, nor speak at thing, nor be sheltered beneath any roof of law. Yikes! There were 2 main types: lesser outlawry lasting 3 years, and greater outlawry, which lasted forever, basically like being unfollowed by society with no chance to reapply. Under greater outlawry, anyone could kill you without legal consequence. Yes, you heard that right. A legal murder hall pass, like a medieval purge, but colder and with fewer leather jackets. Historians still argue whether these exiles were meant to be moral cleansing or just crowd control. But what's not debated is the fact that some exiles made the best of it. Some even came back richer with stories of Greenland walruses and weird fish with human teeth. Take the case of Grettir the Strong. Exiled for manslaughter, he spent years evading bounty hunters, talking to ghosts, and lifting improbable boulders until his eventual doom. But in the meantime, he became a local legend and an excellent warning. Don't be the guy who stabs someone during a poetry contest. You lean forward slightly, letting the next line slip out like snowfall. One who is exiled may not be named at feasts, nor may songs be sung in his honor, until his debt to the land is paid in time or blood. Yeah, Iceland took memory seriously. Even forgetting someone's name on purpose had legal implications. You could literally be fined for erasing someone with silence. But not all exiles were dramatic. Some were more like awkward enforced vacations. Picture this: a guy cheats on his neighbor's wife, gets caught, and rather than face fines or honor duels, he's told to spend 3 years abroad thinking about what he did. Today, we'd call that a gap year. And because no list of medieval consequences is complete without a loophole, here's one for you. If an exiled person could find someone else willing to accept their sentence in their place, usually a relative or extremely unfortunate friend, they could technically return early. It's the world's least fun gift certificate. Quirky fringe tidbit. There was once a legal argument made that a man couldn't be exiled because he already lived in exile, having built a house on a glacier where no one visited. The court responded by extending his exile to include any place a seal might sunbathe. You can't make this stuff up. Except you kind of have to, because the records are, let's say, selectively preserved. So you keep reading: if a man gives shelter to an outlaw, he too shall share in his fate, and his goods may be claimed by any freeman. Yep. Harboring an outlaw meant instant real estate liquidation. It also made for a lot of very careful questions before anyone handed out blankets. Of course, exile wasn't always solitary. Sometimes small groups were sent off together, forming awkward little outpost societies that were part monastery, part pirate crew, and part very cold book club. Some even recorded their own new laws, carving them into driftwood or singing them in circles like sea shanties gone bureaucratic. You pause briefly, looking up at the gray sky. The clouds seem to gather in thoughtful clumps, as if even the weather is mulling over jurisprudence. And then, because no bedtime history session is complete without unnecessary levels of formality, you recite the final clause of the section: no man shall be exiled without the voices of 30 present freemen and the approval of the law speaker, except in matters of proven blood guilt or challenge unanswered. Translation: you can't kick someone out just because you don't like their soup. There had to be votes, evidence, drama, maybe a goat involved. Still, it's worth noting that exile, for all its severity, was oddly humane. In a time and place where execution required serious justification, sending someone into the wilderness was considered merciful, probably because Iceland's wilderness was a kind of slow-motion execution, only with more scenery. You wrap up your speech and lower your hands. Around you, the listeners stretch, murmur, yawn. One teenager mimics a dramatic swoon, clearly having enjoyed that bit a little too much. You smile to yourself. They won't remember the clauses, maybe, but they'll remember how the law was spoken, how it felt, how it sang even in talk of death and cold and long absences. And that's enough. You shift your weight on the stone and let your voice settle again, soft as sheepskin parchment and just as crinkly in tone. There's a slight breeze coming off the fjord now, just enough to ruffle cloaks and carry your words a little farther across the gathered crowd. A few sheep in the distance bleat in what you choose to interpret as support. Now comes the bit everyone pretends not to care about, but secretly loves: inheritance law. Oh yes. Who gets what when Uncle Thorgeir finally keels over, presumably clutching his favorite ale horn and muttering something about how he definitely wasn't asleep during the last Althing? It's complicated. Icelandic inheritance law wasn't written down until much later, but it was memorized and recited and tweaked so often that you'd swear these people had a built-in Excel sheet somewhere behind their eyes. The basic rule, sons before daughters, but daughters still got their fair share, especially if there were no male heirs. And if there were no children, well, things got spicy. Historians still argue whether adopted heirs had equal claim in all regions, or if that was just a clever workaround used by a few families to avoid the whole dying alone with 30 goats and no one to feed them problem. What's fascinating is the Icelandic obsession with precision in these matters. The weight of inheritance could be measured not just in land or livestock, but in portable items like axes, horses, or that one really fancy imported comb from Dublin. If something was part of your estate, it needed to be named. So yes, people gave legal identities to tables, capes, and occasionally beloved pigs. Take the case of Svanlaug the Good, who once fought to keep a loom. Her aunt left her on the basis that it had been used to weave honor cloth for a local chieftain. The court sided with her, and the loom became part of legal precedent. Somewhere in a saga, it's still probably being used. Now here's a quirky one. Some families buried a portion of their wealth with their dead, not for spiritual reasons, but for legal ones. If something was entombed, it was considered removed from circulation and therefore not subject to squabbling. In other words, if Uncle Thorgeir really didn't want his niece getting the ceremonial fishhook, he'd bury it with himself and call it a day. But of course, with inheritance comes feuds, and with feuds come family sagas. Entire multi-generational blood-soaked soap operas launched over who got which sheep pasture or whose great-grandfather once blinked suggestively at the wrong woman during thing. It all mattered. Every glance, every gift, every goat with a ribbon tied to its horn. You announce a clause now, one that has everyone shifting in place. If a man dies without naming heirs, his estate shall pass first to his brothers, then to their sons, and if none be found to the nearest freeman who has kept his name alive through story or song. Yes, inheritance could technically go to someone who merely kept your memory alive, like a bard, or a neighbor with a good memory and suspiciously good timing. That opens a whole mess of legal complications, like when two rival poets claimed they'd been the official memory keeper of a dead man's household. It ended with a public verse duel followed by some light rock throwing. The court ruled in favor of the poet with the better rhyme scheme. You can't make this stuff up. Fringe legal footnote. There's some evidence that ghosts could contest inheritance, or at least people believed they could. In one particularly moldy saga, a dead uncle returns in a dream to correct the reading of his will, because apparently the living executor had forgotten to mention the 3 crates of barley stored under the floorboards. The next day the crates were found. Coincidence? Maybe. But the court adjusted the will anyway. Ghosts, the ultimate auditors. You let your tone soften as you list the parts of a typical Icelandic will. Land first, then tools, then livestock, then household items, then any claimable debts, and finally things of no particular value but high personal sentiment. These last bits were often overlooked by outsiders, but locals knew the real treasure lay there. A carved spoon, a woolen hood, a belt buckle said to bring good luck in courtroom debates. You quote an old phrasing, "The last thing taken from a man's house shall be the story of his kindness. Let it pass if nothing else does to his kin." It's not legally binding, but people remember it. You can feel the quiet hum of recognition in the crowd. And of course, when all else failed, when heirs were missing and debates grew too long, the community would vote quietly, firmly on what felt right. Consensus mattered more than blood sometimes. Iceland was a nation of practical dreamers, sentimental legalists. As the breeze picks up again, you glance down at your next set of memory cues. Nothing written, just the shaped bones of spoken law stored in your throat like carved charms. Around you, children begin to whisper questions to their parents who owned the field near the marsh. What happened to old Carrie's fish barrel? And why did nobody ever contest the rights to that broken boat near the beach? You smile. That's the thing about inheritance. It's less about what you get and more about what people remember to ask about. You clear your throat again, not because it's dry, but because it's the subtle ceremonial signal that you're about to move on from who gets what when someone dies to what happens when someone just won't shut up during the thing. Yes, tonight we move into the delicate area of legal disputes. You might think a place with no king, no standing army, and no central enforcement agency would collapse into chaos. And sometimes it did. But most of the time, Icelandic society kept things together with nothing but threats of outlawry, family shame, and a truly impressive amount of talking. Disputes could range from sheep theft to insult land borders to eye contact misinterpretation. And you, the law speaker, you were not the judge, but you were the guide, the archive, and the soothing presence who could recite the exact line of law about where someone could legally throw their neighbor's dung without committing trespass. 50 paces past the hedge for those taking notes. A mainstream fact in medieval Iceland law was enforced through a court system divided by regional things and a central althing. 4 quarter courts settled most disputes, and a final fifth court handled appeals unless someone challenged the law itself, which only a select few could even attempt. The crowd before you tonight is unusually quiet, not because they're well behaved, but because a minor dispute between two goat herders escalated earlier over the rightful ownership of a particularly fluffy specimen named Steinbjörn. The case isn't yours to decide, but your job is to remind everyone what the law says about goat napping, fleece fraud, and the surprisingly strict rules about livestock impersonation. Fringe tidbit: one case tells of a man disguising his neighbor's prize ram as a foreign gift sheep by dyeing it with charcoal and seaweed. The scam held for nearly a week until the animal wandered into the neighbor's house unprompted and headbutted the family stew pot. The stew survived. The man's reputation didn't. You now begin reciting the phrasing used in legal assemblies to open a case. Here I place my word before the law rock as one who seeks not fire but fairness. It's ceremonial. No one has to say it, but if you do, people listen harder. The words carry weight not because of any magic, but because repetition in this culture is magic. The accused party steps forward not in real life, but in your narrative example, and you calmly explain the typical progression of a case. Witnesses are named and must be approved by both parties. If there are none, character testimony will do. Hearsay is discouraged unless it's very entertaining. A hush falls over the imagined crowd. And then comes the wrinkle: historians still argue whether Icelandic legal cases were truly impartial or whether community relationships skewed justice more often than not. In other words, did Uncle Thorleif win that land dispute because of precedent, or because his cousin knew the law speaker's cousin's goose, probably both. Back to the trial. After evidence is shared, the disputing parties must each swear oaths of truth. If either one stutters, looks down, or gods forbid starts sweating, things get awkward fast. Body language in a land of oral law counts for a lot. It's the closest thing to handwriting analysis Iceland has. Judgment is passed not by a single person, but by a panel of free men selected from among the community and sworn to fairness. They deliberate aloud in front of everyone. No secrets, no side rooms. If the verdict is unpopular, the crowd may murmur, but they rarely riot. After all, they could be next. There's a tale more whispered than written about a clever woman named Frida who won a border dispute by reciting not the laws directly, but songs that contained the laws within them. Each verse referenced a detail of the boundary stones, the inheritance clause, the grazing rights. It was so elegant the opposing side withdrew out of sheer poetic defeat. Her goat, incidentally also named Steinbjörn, became a minor folk hero. Your voice softens now as you detail what happens when someone loses their case. If the penalty is mild, they pay fines, often in silver wool or smoked fish. If it's severe, they may be declared semi-outlawed, 3 years of exile, or full outlawed, permanent exile, fair game to be hunted. You explain this without judgment, but with enough gravity to make the children listening lean into their parents' cloaks just a little more. A side note, there was no prison system. Iceland didn't have the manpower or the patience to feed someone sitting in a hole. You either made it right, made amends, or made yourself scarce. But here's where things get sleepily philosophical. The law wasn't always about punishment, it was about balance. You weren't trying to ruin your enemy. You were trying to put things back where they belonged. That might mean sheep restitution or public apology or once a ceremonial spoon duel. Don't ask. You ease your words into a lull, now describing the ritual of closing a case. Both sides are expected to speak a final phrase. Let this matter lie as cold stones on the stream bed. If they don't, the feud remains open, and the thing will see them again next season. Around the edges of the assembly field, people start to drift into quiet chatter. They know what you're doing, slowing the tempo, drawing breath before the next legal tangle. But they're still listening, always listening. And somewhere in a distant part of the crowd, a small boy repeats one of your phrases under his breath, as if trying it on for size. You smile, another memory stored. Another future law speaker, perhaps. The day is long, and so are the disputes. But you don't get a break, not really. You're not just the law speaker during formal assembly hours. No people catch you while you're chewing dried cod behind a turf wall or halfway through relieving yourself behind a rock just to ask you if an old agreement from their great-grandfather's time still counts, if the cow involved is now a sheep. You take a deep breath and trudge toward the temporary law booth, a wooden lean-to just beyond the law rock. It's not glamorous and certainly not private, but it's where you conduct the more sensitive consults: inheritance, confusion, marital dissolutions, stolen poetry accusations. Yes, poetry theft is a thing here. The worst kind of plagiarism, stealing a love verse and reciting it as your own. Tonight, someone wants to resolve one such case. A young skald swears an older bard stole his romantic lament and passed it off at a feast, winning both applause and a kiss on the cheek from the very woman the poem had mournfully adored from afar. She naturally denies ever inspiring anything mournful, and insists it was a happy little rhyme about cheese. You listen, you sort, and you recite. Your role isn't to give judgment here, but to provide clarity. Like that human version of a law book that also occasionally sighs and mutters again with the cheese poem. A mainstream historical fact, Icelanders held immense respect for poetry as legal testimony. The ability to encode law into verse made it easier to memorize and harder to forget or ignore. In some cases, parties would present sung legal arguments accompanied by lyres or even spoons tapped against drinking horns. It was courtroom karaoke medieval edition, fringe detail. In one record, a man won a cow by singing a 9-verse ballad detailing the cow's birth branding and awkward limp ending, with a pun so bad the losing side laughed and conceded the point. The pun utterly undeniable. Translation debates still rage about whether that joke existed in Old Norse. Some say it's a modern historian's embellishment. But come on, even Viking cows deserve punchlines. The crowd thins after lunch, cold barley cakes and seal meat, nothing to inspire further poetry, and you settle into a quieter part of the afternoon. These are your favorite moments, not the brawling declarations, but the hushed questions from nervous farmers. A woman with snow-white braids asks if her dead husband's promise to build a shared fence still holds even if the neighbor already built it out of spite. You murmur the old law. If the fence was built before the agreement's expiry and without invitation, it belongs to no one until a third party declares it neutral. Historians still argue whether this neutrality clause was applied fairly or used as a loophole for all sorts of mischief. There's a famous case where two families kept rebuilding the same stretch of fence on alternating weeks, each time declaring the others unwelcome. The fence stood for 30 years. No one used the land behind it, but at least the goats had excellent shade. You stretch your legs. It's time for the seasonal announcements. Another task that falls to you, reminding everyone about the updated travel routes, bridge fees, toll customs, and the all-important dung zone regulations. Yes, again with the dung. It's Iceland. It's valuable. It smells terrible. It fuels half the country. There's a mild debate over whether a newly formed hot spring qualifies as taxable bathing space. One clan says yes, it sits on a trade path. The other says no, it scalds the feet of any poor soul who tries to relax in it. You settle it with a quote from a century-old ruling: "If the steam blinds the traveler, let it remain wild," which is a lovely way of saying not our problem. One younger man approaches you with something trickier. He believes the oral contract made by his father traded a horse for fishing rights is being ignored now that both parties are dead. Can an oath echo past the grave? Can spoken agreements outlive the speakers? You stroke your beard even if it's not that long, because it's the sort of gesture law speakers are expected to make before answering questions like these. Only if the river remembers, you say, which is both metaphorical and legally valid. If the community recalls the trade, if others witnessed it, then yes, the oath stands. But if not, the waters carry it away. The man nods, half accepting that his inheritance is at the mercy of memory. You watch him walk away toward the booths, kicking a rock in mild frustration, and you think maybe it's time to compose another verse, one about memory and rivers and fish that don't care who owns the bank as long as the bugs keep falling in. A small crowd forms again. It's almost dusk, and people sense there's still a final case before supper. It's a double complaint, two families accusing each other of field hoarding. The boundary stones are in dispute and someone's been moving them. You know this game. Stone shifting is as old as stone placing. You call out the relevant law. Stones must be heavy enough to require two men to lift, otherwise they're invalid as borders. Both sides pause, glance at the suspiciously mobile stones, and begin muttering excuses about earthquakes and overly enthusiastic goats. You nod, let them settle it over ale later. This is what the law is here, not a sword, but a sieve. It filters drama into discussion. It makes loud things quiet again. As the sun dips behind the horizon, a child asks if law speakers ever forget. You look down, smile gently, and whisper, only the boring parts. Which means, of course, never. Your knees are a little stiff as you rise, but you've still got work to do. The sky is an Arctic lavender, the air is turning sharper, and the shadows at Thingvellir stretch long like sleepy cats across the mossy stones. You make your way through the quieter campfires of the assembly grounds, dodging spilled mead-flapping cloaks and the occasional goat who thinks it's entitled to part of your cloak. The evening cases are looser. Less life or death, more my cousin owes me a boat, or can I name my new son after a relative who was outlawed? That last one earns a murmur from the crowd. Naming customs matter here, not just sentiment, but reputation. There are old laws about avoiding names that might summon shame or old feuds. You quote from memory again, a child shall not bear the name of a man who died in dishonor unless the tale of his dishonor be overturned by verdict or vengeance. Which means, yes, technically, you can name your kid after your criminal uncle if you've avenged him or written a poem convincing enough that people decide he wasn't so bad after all. Icelandic parenting, everyone. The crowd chuckles. It's getting dark, and there's something oddly soothing about legal riddles by firelight. One elderly woman wrapped in an orange wool shawl mutters that it used to be better when laws were simpler. You don't disagree. But then again, the simpler laws are the ones people twist the hardest. Like the rule about hospitality owed to strangers, which has been used as both a defense for theft and an excuse to keep goats indoors. Depends on the stranger. Depends on the goat. You gather yourself. There's still one duty left tonight, a ritual more than a requirement. Before the crowd disperses, you recite what's known as the winter clauses. A mainstream historical fact each year at the Althing, the law speaker would repeat key seasonal laws, regulations about winter grazing rights, sheltering obligations, and even the proper disposal of animal waste in frozen conditions. These weren't thrilling, but they mattered deeply to survival. Tonight you begin with the clause about snowpaths. In times of snow deeper than the calf, no man shall block the traveled way, be it with cart, fence, or herd, lest he pay 3 hides and a sheep. It sounds oddly poetic in the firelight, like you're casting a charm against the weather itself. You continue. If the ice takes the bridge, another must be built before Yule, or all men must turn back and trade shall pause. There's a hum from the crowd, a cadence. The repetition lulls them like a bedtime story where the stakes involve frostbite and lost sheep. Quirky tidbit. The winter clauses once included a rule about icicles. If a neighbor's roof drips meltwater onto your walkway and it ices over and you slip, they owe you a duck. No one's quite sure why a duck. Historians suspect it had less to do with actual injury and more with mild humiliation, because nothing says you've been wronged like receiving a confused waterfowl as compensation. Still you keep going, voice low and steady. Snow shall be swept from all threshold paths before dawn, or be named cursed ground. The words are ancient, strange, comforting. You could probably recite them in your sleep, and maybe sometimes do. A child's head nods off onto her father's knee. Another person wraps their cloak tighter. Even the goats have stopped bleeding. You end the clauses with a murmur. Let no man forget what keeps him warm. Wood-stacked, roof-patched guests fed. The laws of warmth are the first laws of all. Historians still argue whether these laws of warmth were codified officially or simply shared through ritual passed down by word, not tablet. Some even suggest that winter laws were intentionally poetic to help children memorize them, turning survival into song. Others argue they were just easier to chant when drunk. Maybe both. It's Iceland. You step away from the fire, now returning to your booth. Your scribe is asleep on a mat of reed's quill still in hand, a dried ink trail leaking onto their nose. You don't wake them, they'll catch up. Instead, you sit by yourself for a moment, chewing on a piece of smoked lamb, listening to the gentle sound of tents rustling in the breeze. From a distance, someone's playing a flute, or trying to. It might actually be a sheep with a cold. You let your eyes close for a breath. Not sleep, just a pause. The kind of moment where the mind stops grinding and lets the law hum in the background like a lullaby. It's in these quiet lulls that you remember the real reason you do this. Not the prestige, not that there's much. Not the food, not unless you love dried fish in every form imaginable. It's the sound of language held together by memory, of a society still deciding together what it means to be fair. A flickering torch nearby catches a moth. It flutters and escapes. Someone coughs, and somewhere nearby a teenager is absolutely about to break some minor rule involving fermented shark and borrowed boots. You'll deal with that tomorrow. For now you listen to the wind combing through grass, the laws of the land still echoing in your chest like a long, slow chant. One more clause before sleep. Let the night be long. Let the fire burn steady. Let the words remain. You wake before the sun because that's what the law speaker does. No rooster crows here, no alarm bell rings, just the slow churn of early Icelandic light, turning the grass from pewter to pale green, and the sounds of the camp returning to life, one clang of a cookpot at a time. Your back cracks like a dry birch twig as you stand. Even the mighty forget they're not 19 anymore. Still, there's comfort in the routine, a splash of freezing water to the face from a nearby stream, which absolutely counts as a form of punishment. In the colder months, a stiff hunk of rye flatbread, chewed thoughtfully while eyeing your scribes, and a few minutes spent rehearsing today's trickiest cases in your head. But first, something more delicate: mediation. You've barely had time to finish your bread when a red-faced chieftain stomps into your tent, followed by his equally furious sister, who is wielding, of all things, a broken spindle as a weapon. You barely raise an eyebrow. Another day, another land dispute masquerading as a sibling rivalry. This is the part of the job nobody sings about: the quiet negotiations, the whispered agreements, the art of knowing when to quote a law and when to invent a compromise that sounds ancient enough to stick. This case, the sister claims her brother diverted a stream to flood her grazing field out of spite. The brother insists it was an accident caused by beavers. You silently note that Iceland doesn't even have native beavers. Still you listen. Nod. Let the tension unravel one word at a time. Sometimes people just want to be heard by someone whose voice can echo louder than their own. You weigh their claims, reference the water rights clauses from memory, and suggest a compromise. The stream remains as is. But the brother owes his sister 3 sheep and a favor to be named later. Possibly during hay season, possibly involving more streams. They grumble but agree. A mainstream historical fact: law speakers in medieval Iceland weren't just courtroom narrators, they also acted as mediators and respected neutral parties in disputes between families, farms, and even rival clans. Their word wasn't law in the judicial sense, but it carried immense social weight. Agreements they brokered often stuck because of reputation, not force. You record the agreement by repeating it aloud twice while your half-awake scribe scribbles it down in the growing light. And then on to the next. There's a boy no more than 13 who's memorized a portion of the law and wants to prove it. He recites it to you like it's a bard's poem. You test him, misquote a line, substitute a clause, insert a fictional punishment involving smoked herring, and watch him correct you with a glint of pride. This is how law survives here, not in books but in heads: repetition, rhythm, respect. You tell him he's almost ready to be a lug madur someday, and his chest puffs out like a puffin catching a tailwind. The quirky tidbit today: there's a minor clause in the law that allows a man to legally challenge another to a duel if he's publicly accused of being a seal in disguise. Yes, really. No one's quite sure if it's metaphorical or the result of one very dramatic beach misunderstanding, but the clause remains technically enforceable and utterly baffling. You're not surprised when someone brings it up later that afternoon. It's a slow hour, the air buzzing with flies and gossip, when 2 fishermen approach. One accuses the other of singing to seals during full moons. The accused leans on his boat hook like a man who's heard this before. You quote the seal disguise clause, mostly to amuse the crowd, and remind them that to invoke it properly, one must produce 2 witnesses and a herring tied with blue ribbon. They laugh. Dispute defused. Historians still argue whether the Sealman clause was a real belief in Selkie's mythical seal people who could shed their skins and walk as humans, or just an elaborate rural insult. Some point to regional folklore, others to the strategic use of absurdity as social release. You prefer to believe it was both. The sun climbs. Lunch is salted cod and sour whey, both of which taste exactly as they sound. Still you eat because the afternoon promises 3 inheritance disputes, 1 brewing feud over sheep tracks, and a recitation challenge from a rival's apprentice. The rival, by the way, is named Snorri because, of course, he is. Snorri is younger, better groomed, and deeply annoying in the way that only someone with good handwriting and an ego the size of a fjord can be. You nod at him across the camp. He nods back, smirking. There's a wordless understanding between law speakers. You don't debate. You duel in memorization. Later, under scrutiny in front of the crowd, Snorri's apprentice takes the stage just before supper. His voice is strong, his posture confident. He recites the clauses on livestock trespass with almost no errors. Almost. You catch it: a misquoted fine. 3 U's instead of 5. You let it slide, then gently ask, would the fine still apply in a snowless winter? He hesitates, stumbles. Victory is yours. You don't gloat much. Later, a farmer brings you a bottle of his strongest dandelion brew. For besting the Snorri line, he says. You take a polite sip and hope your eyebrows don't leap off your face. It tastes like bitter grass and bee spit. But you smile anyway. The crowd disperses again as they always do into tents and twilight. You sit for a moment with your scribe who's humming an old verse about fish thieves and their doomed love affairs. It's a strangely beautiful sound, even if the lyrics involve pickled herring. The day fades. The laws hum softly in your chest, a living library that never closes. And tomorrow they'll ask again, and you'll answer. Your night is short and the wind is long. It prowls through the camp like a forgetful ghost tugging at tent flaps, curling around cooking pots and sifting through the tall grass that surrounds the law rock. You sleep lightly, half dreaming of clauses and cattle fines until the first soft clatter of morning life draws you back to consciousness. Today is a formal day, which means robes, though the term robes is generous. What you wear is really more of a large woolen suggestion of authority. It itches, it's heavy, it smells faintly of sea salt and mothballs. But when you stride out to the law rock in it, people part like you're a prophet, or at least someone who might misquote a law in their favor. The law rock itself is exactly what it sounds like, a flat-topped outcrop, weathered by wind, rain, and centuries of human frustration. You climb it slowly, not for drama, but because you're not 20 anymore, and also because the wind is trying to yank your robe off. Modesty, it turns out, is not guaranteed even at the highest point of judicial power. From this height, you can see the whole assembly, blankets and cloaks laid out in uneven circles, pots steaming on low fires, children chasing each other with sticks that are definitely not weapons until they are, and clusters of chieftains practicing their stoic poses. And above it all, the smell of sheep. Always sheep. You clear your throat. No bell tolls, no drums roll. Your voice is the announcement. You begin to speak. A mainstream historical fact. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 CE, is the oldest surviving parliament in the world. And for hundreds of years, its centerpiece was the law speaker, a single individual who recited the entire legal code from memory over a 3-year cycle, publicly and aloud, so the law remained living and known. Today you're reciting portions of the Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code, that sounds like the name of a Viking goose, but is really just a series of oral and written regulations, covering everything from homicide to haystack boundaries. You let the words pour out. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady. The cadence of justice is more lullaby than sermon. Murmurs ripple through the crowd as you reach the clause about sorcery. It's a favorite. You do your best not to roll your eyes as people lean in, hoping for mention of trolls or curses. But no, it's mostly about what constitutes proof of magic answer. Not much in the appropriate fine, usually livestock or exile, depending on how cursed someone feels. Then comes the quirky tidbit. There's a law that allows you to legally insult someone's manhood, but only if you do it in verse. Yes, if you compose a poem claiming someone's beard is patchier than an undercooked oatcake, you're safe from prosecution. If you just say it, that's slander. Naturally, this has led to a tradition of insult poetry duels that are only slightly less vicious than physical combat. You've seen grown men break down in tears over a particularly cutting rhyme about their knees. Snorri tried it once. You beat him with a poem about his ears resembling wilting mushrooms. He hasn't forgiven you. You finish the first set of recitations and the crowd breaks to stretch, eat, and air their grievances. You, of course, stay on the rock, not because you have to, but because tradition insists the law speaker must remain above the crowd during sessions. There are worse places to spend a morning. The wind is brisk, the view is decent, and you get a solid 30 minutes of solitude before the next dispute is dragged into earshot. This one involves a goat, of course it does. The goat allegedly consumed a sacred charm buried under a neighbor's cairn. The accused goat's owner insists that the goat cannot be held responsible because she can't even read. You pause, nod solemnly, and then quote the livestock trespass laws. You also invent a new clause about sacred objects needing to be stored above goat snack height. Nobody questions it. Your word is, after all, sort of law-ish. Historians still argue whether law speakers were allowed to adjust or embellish legal phrasing during their recitations. Some suggest this was how minor changes entered the oral code over time, by well-meaning or mischief-making speakers tweaking phrasing to fit the moment. Others argue it was a strictly memorized system with zero room for improvisation. You personally find it hard to believe a profession full of poets and storytellers didn't slip in a few flourishes now and then. Back down from the rock you finally sit. The scribe beside you has been copying today's rulings into a leather-bound scroll, his fingers blotched with ink and frustration. You ask if he caught the goat decision correctly. He says mostly, "I may have accidentally written oath instead of goat." You blink, nod. Decide oath-eating is probably going to become a minor superstition now. The air thickens with mid-afternoon quiet, the kind that blankets gatherings once the major dramas have passed. Children sleep, chieftains squint into the wind like philosophers, and someone's pot of soup boils over with a wet hiss. You sip skyr and honey, wondering if your knees will ever forgive you for the law rock's uneven surface. Then comes the best part of the day, quiet recitation practice. A small circle of apprentices gather near the stream, each taking turns, reciting fragments of law. You sit with them not as a judge, but as a mentor. You smile when one misplaces a clause, frown thoughtfully when another forgets the phrasing of a fine schedule. They're trying, that matters more than precision. You remind them of a trick tie the lines to the rhythm of walking. Many law speakers, you say, learned by pacing, letting their feet imprint the beat of justice into the ground. It's why some of the oldest trails in Iceland are strangely straight. They were beaten into existence by men remembering laws. You walk with them for a while, 1 foot, one line, one clause at a time. It feels right. The wind has quieted by nightfall, and so has the assembly field. What was once a clamor of bargaining proclamations and unsanctioned flute solos has dulled into the low murmur of campfires and woolen yawns. You walk slowly back toward the stream where the apprentices are gathering, again, not for recitations this time, but for something older, softer, and stranger, memory games by firelight. You join them, of course, not because you must, but because you remember being here once yourself, cold hands wrapped around a bowl of barley stew, straining your ears to hear the cadence of a clause over the crackle of flames. The young ones begin modestly tossing around snippets of law phrased like riddles. If a man breaks another man's boat but not the oars, what part of the fine may be shared? You raise an eyebrow and answer with a smirk, none if the oars were borrowed and the boat was beached. Laughter ripples out. You still remember that one because the chieftain who made the ruling tripped into the sea halfway through announcing it. Memory is a slippery creature, sometimes tied to rhythm, sometimes to embarrassment, and very often to smell. Nothing cements a fine schedule into your hippocampus quite like a roasted seal slipping off its spit. A mainstream historical fact: the role of law speaker wasn't just about law, it was about memory. These Icelandic officials, especially for the 13th century, were the custodians of their people's entire legal framework, which existed only in spoken word. It was their duty to remember, recite, and sometimes reinterpret hundreds of laws that evolve with each generation. You sip from a shared cup of warm mead passed around like a ceremonial torch. One of the apprentices, a bright-eyed girl with a braid that stretches to her waist, asks how you manage to hold so much in your head. You pause, then tap your chest. It's not all in the head. Some of it's stored in here. It sounds silly, but it's true. You've repeated the laws so often that your bones know the rhythm. Your breath adjusts to clauses. Your hands twitch at the mention of coin weights and witness counts. And your dreams are filled with conditional statements. The quirky tidbit tonight comes in the form of a song, yes, a song. One of the apprentices has turned the livestock taxation rules into a chant that honestly slaps. It's got rhythm, it's got rhyme, and it's got entirely too many euphemisms for goat enclosure. You all join in, of course. That's half the secret to remembering things: make them absurd, sing them often, and shout them across rivers like declarations of war. As the song fades, you stretch out by the fire and let your eyes flutter half closed. The stars are clean and cold above you, glittering like punctuation marks. You imagine them as footnotes to the night's recitations. See also fines for fence encroachment under moonlight. Historians still argue whether law speakers composed new laws themselves or merely recited existing ones. Some suggest the line between judge, poet, and politician was as blurred as your vision after too much mead. Others insist they were simply vessels, nothing more. You suspect the truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle, like the marshy bit of land everyone fights over, but no one wants to farm. Your eyelids dip. A log pops. Somewhere behind you, a sheep coughs, a hilariously human sound that no one ever gets used to. Then a voice beside you: tell us about the time the wind stole the law book. You open one eye. It's the youngest apprentice, barely past the age of losing baby teeth, but already quoting inheritance law like a future menace. You sigh, smile, and begin. The tale is half true, half embellishment. Yes, once a page of laws did fly off during a particularly strong gust. No, it did not hit a bishop in the face and land in a stew pot. But that's the version people like, so that's the version you tell. By the time you reach the part where the bishop tries to declare the stew anointed, most of the fire circle is shaking with the kind of silent laughter that ends in hiccups. And yet, nestled within the absurdity is the lesson: law is not stiff parchment. It's living memory passed hand to hand, told and retold, until it sinks deep and blooms like lichen on stone. You lie back again. The fire snaps softly beside you. Sleep presses close like a sheepdog curling at your knees. But before the silence closes in fully, someone murmurs, do you ever forget anything? It's not a challenge, it's curiosity, and perhaps a bit of fear. You answer without opening your eyes, only on purpose. You don't explain. They'll learn. There are laws best left unspoken, clauses bound to ancient crimes or judgments, so tangled in blood and shame that even the wind won't carry them. But most you remember, because someone has to. The moon creeps higher. The mead runs out. One by one, the apprentices drift to their tents or lean against stones or pillows of moss, mumbling half-finished sentences about breach of peace or improper stacking of dried fish. You drift to eventually. Half asleep, you murmur lines of restitution and thresholds for dispute. They blend into the breeze. And above it all, the law rock stands silent now, but waiting. The morning returns with the kind of hush that feels more like reverence than routine. Even the ravens on the cliff seem reluctant to break the stillness. You rise slowly, joints humming like harp strings, tuned overnight by the cold. Your cloak smells faintly of peat smoke mead and someone else's sheep, likely the one that sat on you during the night. Occupational hazard. Today is the third and final day of the Althing, and the murmurs across the valley are a bit sharper, like blades honed on stone. People have decisions to make, grudges to settle, and oaths to either seal or cleverly wiggle out of. The temporary world built here, this wandering city of wool tents, driftwood benches, and hot tempers, is about to vanish again until next summer. But before that happens, you have one more recitation to perform, the seasonal roll of laws, updated and edited live with all the thrilling pageantry of, the thrilling pageantry of standing on a rock for 2 hours while listing acceptable goat trespass thresholds. You begin your slow climb up the law rock as the crowd gathers. No megaphone, no paper notes. Just you, your lungs, and a voice that's been trained for projection since your voice cracked for the first time during a cattle theft arbitration. One historical fact that gets surprisingly little attention: these public readings weren't optional flair. Under the Icelandic legal system, at least one-third of the law code had to be recited aloud every summer in a particular rhythm to a gathered audience. The purpose wasn't just transmission, it was preservation through repetition. If the people forgot, the law died. You reach the top of the law rock and take in the sea of fur-lined cloaks, wind-chapped faces, and several small children being bribed with salted fish to sit still. You clear your throat and begin. It starts with the classics: property boundaries, guest rights, dispute mediation over insult injury, and poorly trained horses. The cadence is hypnotic, an ancient rhythm that lives halfway between lullaby and legal threat. But then halfway through, something odd happens. You skip a word. Just one. A single syllable. It slips past you like a wet pebble and vanishes into the breeze. You blink. No one notices. The phrase still works. The meaning's intact. But you notice. Your breath stumbles just slightly. Your tongue clicks back into alignment, and you go on. The quirky detail here: every law speaker had their own backup memory tricks, small private rituals to keep the ocean of words from spilling over. One old law speaker supposedly tied specific clauses to specific beard braids, like each twist held a different tax regulation. Another chewed certain herbs before speaking, claiming they made the words float better. You personally count stones with your toes in your sandals. It sounds weird, and it is. But it works. You finish the reading. The crowd applauds politely, a sheep sneezes, a child yells boring and is immediately shushed by his embarrassed aunt. All is as it should be. Historians still argue whether these public recitations were purely ceremonial by the 12th century, or if they continued to function as a true transmission of civic knowledge. Some claim that written law had already supplanted the oral versions, making these readings quaint relics. Others believed they remained vital reminders of a community's shared identity, audible proof that Iceland's people still agreed on the rules of being Icelandic. As you descend from the rock, you are met with a mug of ale and the grateful nod of a chieftain whose family's land claim you accidentally reinforced. He doesn't say thank you, he just gestures toward a pile of firewood he's apparently decided is yours now. A young boy runs up and tugs at your sleeve. He holds a carved wooden rune stick, probably made by his father. Will you sign it? He asks. You blink. You know I don't use ink. He shrugs. Then say something at it. That works too. You lean down and whisper a clause about sheep theft penalties. The boy beams like you just made the sun come up. He runs off to show his friends and you're left grinning like an idiot. You wander back toward your tent, past circles of people settling disputes, trading stories, or just lying in the grass, trying to digest their sixth smoked trout. And here amid the noise and dust and leftover law scrolls, you feel it, that old truth humming again beneath the surface. This isn't just about laws, it's about memory, about rhythm, about holding something fragile in your voice until it takes root in someone else's. You sit beside your tent watching the valley exhale. And then you see them, two apprentice law speakers, pacing, muttering, practicing. Their mouths move without sound, their fingers counting clauses on invisible strings. You almost call out, almost correct one of them on a point of marital restitution ratios, but you don't. They'll figure it out. You lean back. Let the sky blur. Let the grass cradle your shoulders. Let the words, thousands of them, spiral behind your eyes like constellations, each clause its own twinkling, perfectly placed star. And for the first time all week, you don't rehearse anything. You just rest. The valley is emptying now, like a great wooden tub slowly draining back into the hills and fjords from which its people came. Cloaks flap in the rising wind, cartwheels creak in the damp grass, and the last of the embers curl faint trails of smoke toward the sky. Your tent, once wedged between a herring merchant and a rune carver with suspiciously soft hands, now stands lonely and half-folded, swaying like a tired scarecrow. You're not in a hurry. Law speakers rarely are. One of the few perks of memorizing the entire legal corpus of a society, no one asks you to load a wagon. You stretch your legs and let the final moments of the all things settle in your bones like warm stones. It's been a lot. You've mediated sheep disputes, recited war protocols, gently reminded an inebriated goat owner that no reciting poetry doesn't count as a binding legal contract. And you've watched the next generation stumble and squint their way through the early stages of what might eventually become memory worthy of a rock. Now, as the voices thin and the sky grows wider, you begin your own slow walk back to the coast. It's not exactly a commute, more of a guided wander, with occasional pauses to nap in moss and mutter clauses about outlawry into the breeze just to keep yourself sharp. Here's a mainstream historical truth that still surprises people. Iceland didn't have a king for most of its early medieval period. No crown, no throne, no royal courts. Just a network of chieftains and a gathering of minds held together by legal memory. The law wasn't just rules, it was the glue. And the glue had to be recited, re-recited, and locked behind the eyes of people like you. You remember the first time someone called you law speaker and meant it. You'd been an apprentice for years by then, chewing syllables under your breath like they were tough bread crust. One day during a rain-delayed meeting near the sea, Your mentor lost his voice, trying to shout over a chorus of drunk sailors. He nudged you forward, you do it, and your first recitation slipped out, half shaking, half sure. The oldest chieftain there clapped exactly once when you finished. Didn't forget the oat tax clause, he muttered. That was it, you were in. There's a quirky tidbit you've never quite confirmed, though the other law speakers love to repeat it. Supposedly one particularly nervous apprentice once tattooed the entire civil code onto his arms and legs. Unfortunately, Icelandic weather being what it is, the ink smudged during a storm, and he was forever known as Thorbjorn the mostly legal. Historians still argue whether law speakers like you were more akin to priests or performers. Some think you were the last living link to an oral past that refused to be snuffed out by ink and vellum. Others claim your role was mostly symbolic by the time manuscripts came into regular use. Your memory feats admired but unnecessary. But deep down, you know the truth lives in the spaces between. There's something sacred about saying the thing out loud, about standing in the rock and watching the words ripple across people's faces, some nodding, some yawning one always asleep, about the feeling of an entire society pressing its ear to your chest and trusting what comes out. And now with the all thing behind you and the sea ahead, you let the words fall silent. You reach the shore just as the clouds begin to melt into dusk, and you find your little skiff still bobbing patiently among the rocks like it hasn't spent the whole week being ignored. You push it out gently, the icy water licking at your boots, and climb in with a practiced grunt. Your oars dip rhythmically, the current nudges you homeward. And that's when it happens, just as you settle into the rhythm, a phrase bubbles up from your chest unbidden. Something obscure, a clause about hay storage during volcanic ashfall. You chuckle, you say it aloud just for yourself, just to hear it. Because that's what you do. You remember. You speak. You float wrapped in mist laws, cradled like lullabies, and Iceland fading behind you into a soft, unreadable blur. So now just let go of the oars in your mind. Let the water do what it's always done, carry you, gently, without question. Let your breath grow longer like the coastline, stretching behind your thoughts, all fjords and fog and quiet stories, whispered by stones. The law in all its dry peculiarities has folded itself neatly back into the folds of your memory. The words are still there, safe and sound, nestled like polished runes beneath a pillow of sleep. There is no more need to recite, no chieftain waiting for a verdict, no apprentice fumbling with a metaphor about sheep. Only the sea beneath you steady and slow. Only the sky above stitched with stars you don't need to name. Only the hush of Iceland holding you like a forgotten scroll. Close your eyes. Let the rock fade. Let the crowd dissolve. Let the words drift out across the waves like drowsy gulls. You did your part. You remembered. And now you rest.